Well, welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast, everyone. And today I'm joined by James Valliant and Professor Robyn Faith Walsh. And today we're going to be discussing the politics of the New Testament, basically a continuation of where our last discussion left off. And we're also going to be getting into, of course, Greco-Roman cultural influence on the New Testament. Well, thank you both for joining me today.
My pleasure. And yeah. Honored to be back with Professor Walsh, by the way.
Oh, that's sweet. Thank you for having us back. I'm glad to continue the conversation. So this is going to be great.
Thank you. So my first question is, how do you view Paul? What are his politics? Do you view him in the same way you look at the Gospels? Like, okay, they're both being influenced by the same Greco-Roman milieu, or do you see something different going on with Paul?
James, do you want to start? You're in the center of the screen, so we can go.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I would have preferred to you happily. Well,
yeah, my question, this particular question, was more focused
for
to
me.
You, actually.
But, yes.
Okay, I wanted to give everybody a fair shot before I start,
you too,
taking over, because I have a tendency to ramble.
I know no that, so.
So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that I can approach that question. On the level of, let's say, just call it cultural influence before we even get into political influence. I do see the Gospels, if we're talking about the canonical Gospels, and Paul as being cut more or less from the same cloth, in the sense that I think they are coming from a very similar milieu. And I know that that term is kind of fuzzy and can mean a lot of different things. But what I mean by that is I see the exact same interest in, obviously, Jewish holy books and scripture. But I also see the same interest, particularly in philosophy. And what usually it gets classed as Stoic philosophy, sometimes called Middle Platonism, but this period in probably, the first century, but the early empire going into the second century, where there's a lot of interest in sort of eclectic philosophical ideas that stem from Stoicism as well as from Platonism. And of course, a lot of this gets lost in translation, but I don't think you can quite understand what's meant by terms we take for granted, like spirit. And I've talked about this before, that concept of pneuma. I don't think you can really understand those things the way that Paul and the gospel authors intended them. And I'll put it even more distinctly, I don't think you can really even understand the physics that they understand to be taking place in the ancient world. It's really an idea of science for them without knowing some of that kind of material. As for political interests, I think one thing that Paul puts forward is, and this is going to seem a little funny, and maybe I'm being a little unfair, but I almost think it's sort of like for Paul and maybe let's say Mark, I'm not sure that they think the world as we know it's going to continue for much longer. I think this is particularly the case for Paul. I think as time goes on, by the time you get to his letter to the Romans, he has a little bit of a different line on this, in part because he has to, because I think people have started to ask him, so-and-so has died. So, like, what's going to happen? You said, that Christ was going to come back. Yeah, exactly. Where is he? And so he's had to kind of finesse things, and we can talk about why as the conversation continues on. But I don't think he's as concerned with what we might call earthly authority at his time, as we see in later texts. And there's a school of thought that you can make the argument that, let's just say, go the traditional dating, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, that as time goes on, you see a little bit more of a concern with the political situation, a little bit more of that pushback to what's going on with the empire. But I also think that these authors, again, given their milieu, are engaging in empire in the sense that they are engaging Stoic ideas, which by the time we get to the second century, that's the philosophy of the empire, right? So they're intricately tied. It's kind of a bird's nest here. And so then our task becomes asking questions like, can we tell, given the posture of these authors, the relative posture of these authors to the Roman Empire, anything about how apologetic is this text? Like how much do they see earthly authority? Do they see earthly authority, in this case, the Roman Empire, as a threat? Those are other questions that we can ask. And does that start to answer your question a little bit?
I think it does. When you look at what Paul says in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and also what's going on in First Thessalonians. Like, okay, at one point it's like, okay, archons in league with the devil or behind the death of Jesus, or it's actually Jews in First Thessalonians that they were behind the death of Jesus and the wrath of God came upon them for what they had done to Jesus. What do you think about that? Do you think that he's kind of contradicting himself, or do you think that he is kind of saying that there are the people that killed Jesus are in league with the archons or in league with the devil?
I don't think he intends to make it an admonition against one particular religious group. What I think he sees, because especially, he remains a Pharisee his whole life, and it was well known in the era that, the Jewish quote unquote authorities did not have the authority to crucify. That was a Roman punishment. And that also was a Roman punishment. Paul talks about this curse, that it was cursed to be hung on a tree, and he's quoting scripture there. To him, this was all something being fulfilled, a prophecy to be fulfilled, but one that the Romans fulfill. So I don't think he's particularly interested in naming the Jewish authorities as responsible for that death. To the extent that the Roman authorities are responsible, people would have known that by nature of the fact that he's crucified, right? Like that would have been one of those cultural codes that for us, we have to study and remember and, look at the text and the legal documents to remember this in that period. But that's something anybody in the Roman era would have known is a punishment reserved for people who are not citizens by the hands of the Romans, people who are in a disempowered caste of society. So I think with that in mind, we just have to hold that in tension a little bit with these other ideas. Does that answer your question, or was there another part of the question that I'm forgetting?
I think it does answer it, but it does lead up to this next question. When you look at going back to Paul's politics, and James, I would like you to jump in right when I'm done with this. Is when Paul flees from King Aretas IV, about year 37 CE. He doesn't really state why he's fleeing from Aretas, why Aretas is going after him. The reasons are not stated, but what is happening at that time is that Herod Antipas is mad. Not him. King Aretas is mad at Herod Antipas for divorcing his daughter so that he could marry his own niece. And Aretas attacks Jerusalem. Herod's army is destroyed. And this is about the time when Paul's fleeing. And in Romans 16, Paul makes a brief comment about being a kinsman to somebody called Herodian. Do you think that Aretas' attack on Herod Antipas could be connected with Paul's flight? And if so, would that appear to shed some light on Paul's politics, or potentially being politically affiliated with the Herods?
It's interesting that we don't know more about Paul's background along those lines, because given his relative education, somebody paid for that, right? Like somebody paid or sponsored him to become not only well-educated, but, I think, and of course, with retrospect, one of the great creative minds. And obviously his ideas have become the foundation of Western law and ethics. So, he did a pretty good job.
Religion, yeah.
Yeah, and a whole religion. Yeah.
Apart from that.
Yeah, I forgot about that. So he did an excellent job. So not only was he a skilled mind, but was given the time and space to cultivate that, particularly his creative readings of scripture. And his knowledge of philosophy, as we've been talking about. His education level as revealed through his letter writing. We can talk about how the actual practical elements of how that comes about. But the relative skill he demonstrates shows that we may have mentioned this before. You've talked to other guests. He's had paideia, and he's had pretty advanced education. He's still willing to be pretty eclectic and the philosophy that he deploys. So he's not exactly following what we might call a canon, a developing canon of the Greek and Roman philosophy that he's citing. So he's not so elevated in terms of his cultural, social status that he's not also willing to innovate. So that tells me, it's always tricky to do economics without accidentally falling into the trap of capitalism because of the way we think of that term economics today, but almost like upper middle class, middle class kind of educate, like that kind of mid-range education. And so that tells me, especially the way he describes his actions before his so-called conversion or his turning, that he was some kind of like administrator of some kind. Who for, we don't even know. I'm not even completely convinced by the Tarsus association, which is something we don't get from him specifically, right?
Right.
And I've been doing a little bit of work on this for my second book, so I'm sort of kind of self-owning here a little bit. But I've been working a little bit on why Tarsus, because Tarsus, from what I can tell, was associated in Roman minds with a great area of learning, but on the eastern part of the empire. And so if you were an aristocrat or an elite, you might send your son to Athens to be, if you're already in Rome, right? You might stay in Rome, you might send your son to Athens, you might send him to Alexandria or something like that, right? You wouldn't send your son all the way to Tarsus. And I say sons, not because I'm trying to exclude women, but this is who would have been sent off to be educated. But you wouldn't send your sons to Tarsus necessarily. That's a little too far, but it's known that education in Tarsus is excellent. There's a librarian, I think, from Pergamon who was trained in Tarsus. Like when you look around, you see these little glimmers sometimes within the Roman writing of respect for Tarsus as a center of learning. So it's not too surprising to me. You get to the 2nd century. Who is this guy? Where is he from? Oh, well, he's a great philosopher. Maybe he was from Tarsus, right? So that's a little speculative. So forgive me for speculation, but I feel like, this isn't a university press interview. So I can, I could throw something like that out there. But I think that, but I think it's the kind of thing that, that's the kind of critical thinking that we need to have, and not rely on Acts of the Apostles, for example, on telling us when, where, and how, right? We need to couple that with, what other information do we have about these places? What does Paul tell us himself? So back to your question about the Herodians. Would it surprise me to find out somehow that he was associated with that family? It wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't shock me. But maybe that's as speculative as my Tarsus monologue right now. James, what do you think?
You have it in first person from Paul that he fled from Aretas. And Aretas' attack was specifically against the Herodians here at Antioch. If you were not associated with Herodians, you would probably not have felt the need to flee. That is to say, if you were some neutral Greek or Roman sitting about there, you wouldn't be fleeing. Even many Jews might not have fled Aretas' attack, because not all, in fact, majority of Jews probably weren't too keen on the Herodians. So to be fleeing from Aretas' attack on Antipas suggests that he was associated in some way, in my mind, with the Herodians. The last chapter of Romans, of course, he refers to a kinsman or a fellow clan, depending on how you want to understand that word, because it is a little fuzzy. But he says he has a kinsman named Herodian, little Herod, who belongs perhaps to the household of Aristobulus, definitely a Jewish royal name from the Herodians. And of course, in Philippians, he makes casual references to his complete access to the imperial Praetorian Guard, sends greetings from Caesar's household. As Professor Walsh points out, he may not have been among the most elite educated of his time, but he certainly was literate, which was rare for the time. And so he had some kind of education. He was deeply familiar with Hebrew literature, even if he sort of has to play with it to get his conclusions liberally. Nonetheless,
just a little.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He does seem to be a reasonably well-educated person for the time, especially. And that might suggest that he was, as Professor Walsh says, an aristocrat with a mid-level education, maybe a mid-level aristocrat, or what we might, we can't compare our contemporary world to then, because very teeny populations, very, very rich.
Right, that's what I say. The capitalism thing, we think in terms of our own structure, and it doesn't quite.
It doesn't quite, exactly. Yeah. So when we think of it, we should think of it as a very small elite at the top of the heap there, who are elite and wealthy and educated, and the large majority of people don't have any kind of literacy, much less be able to read and write Greek and be familiar with Hebrew scripture and tradition, as Paul appears to be, at least to some extent.
Can I piggyback one thing? I'm sorry. I can't help myself, and I'll forget. But also, he's reading the Septuagint. The way that it's quoted there. He's utilizing the Septuagint, which is kind of adds to your point.
Yeah, he reads and writes Greek, and he's familiar with Greek scripture in Greek, Hebrew scripture in its Greek form.
Yeah.
But to get to his politics, we have a lot better clues than that, more directly. Romans 13, very famously. It's not as though it's a mere go along with the Romans for purely practical or pragmatic reasons. He announces that the government, presumably the Roman government, are the appointed agents of God on earth, and that is why it is a sin to disobey that law. Our obedience to the existing legal structure is a religious requirement, not simply some practical means of surviving the Roman Empire. More than that, he includes admonitions against rebellion and admonitions to pay your tax as a matter of conscience or morality, not merely as a practical matter. And he makes those distinctions quite clear in Romans 13. So to understand even that comment, though, as well as his other comments, which are consistent in my view with the piece, one has to contrast it with the mainline Jewish Messianic of the first 2 centuries. These people, and it's only in that contrast that I think we really get to the heart of the matter here. The large majority of Jewish Messianics of the first 2 centuries were militant, violently militant. Obviously, they're rebels. They're Torah orthodox. They want to preserve their culture. And it's their culture that they're going to bat for in a difficult war, 2 wars, and all kinds of terrorist activity. So they're militant, separatist nationalists. And when you think about Christian doctrine in that light, it's startlingly contrasting with everything basically we read in the New Testament. It's nationalist, separatist, Torah orthodox, highly militant. They're expecting an earthly Messiah. All of our sources, Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, you name it, tell us that the main cause of the Jewish war were these messianic prophecies. And it's clear from the nature of the military activities, and look at Masada. We were told, at least, that it was mass suicide there. And among the mass suicides, for example, Josephus tells us about the suicide pact at Jotapata, where he was taken. These people were religiously motivated in their war against Rome, and they were nationalist, militant, separatist, Torah orthodox believers in an earthly Messiah. And Messiah was the rallying cry for these rebels. And they are the least likely group to be in favor of any Greco-Roman cultural assimilation as well. I would not expect these Jewish rebels to be moving in the direction of Plotinus, Neoplatonism, or Seneca and Epictetus and contemporary Stoicism either. Nor, if I can cite Dr. MacDonald, Dennis MacDonald, they wouldn't be keen to be using the Iliad and the Odyssey and Euripides' Bacchae as direct references if they were these Jewish militant radicals. In fact, it was a startling paradox that needs to be explained. How is it the mainline, large majority of Jewish Messianics of the first 2 centuries are becoming so Hellenized, are utilizing Greek and Roman philosophy so deeply in ways that I would find very surprising for the people most resistant to Greco-Roman cultural assimilation. That's paradoxical, frankly, and it needs a deeper. Surely the Jewish wars are no accidental coincidence as happening at the exact same time that Christianity is emerging. The emergence of Christianity at the precise time in history when you have most Messianic Jews in open warfare, resisting cultural assimilation from the Greco-Roman world, wanting their own world so they can enforce Torah in their own land for religious reasons. I mean, we find a better idea of what these militants were about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I disagree with Professor Eisenman. I think most of them were written much earlier, but in a Hasmonean context. But on the other hand, they give us a better sense of what Messianic Jews at the time must have believed. Again, apocalypse, these messianic prophecies, militant. Yes, angels would come down and help them in their war, but it was an earthly Messiah that they were seeking. And I've got to believe that, and they're highly resistant to Greco-Roman culture, even if some of Greco-Roman culture is seeping in by osmosis anyway. So it's that contrast that I find so interesting. The whole Jewish war began as a tax rebellion, we're told by Josephus, around 6 AD, under Judas the Galilean, who objected to the Roman census. And so Paul's politics in Romans 13 is carried out very consistently in the Gospels. Jesus not only says, render unto Caesar, but he befriends tax collectors. One of his disciples is a tax collector. In the pseudo-Paulines, they go out of their way to say, slaves obey your masters, even harshly. In the pseudo-Petrines, honor the emperor. Honor the emperor. Nothing could be in greater contrast to the mainline Jewish Messianic in the first 2 centuries, who were militant, separatist, Torah Orthodox nationalists, as if the Greek New Testament is a critical response, specifically to them, both in its political call for peace, but also in its hugely assimilative nature. It's challenging monotheism. In effect, it's imposing this probably misnamed Orphic mystery cults. It's imposing that sort of Greco-Roman religious form of a suffering savior god onto Judaism in an alien way, which would be strikingly paradoxical for any separatist Jewish messianics to be engaged in. So it's this bizarre blending of things at the time. Anti-assimilation ideas are being the basis, foundation for what turns out to be highly assimilated ideas that utilize Greco-Roman literature that fit in with Greco-Roman culture at the time and are profoundly using Greek philosophy, for example. That's striking and needs an explanation, it seems to me. And when we add to it, as you point out, Paul's specific potential connections with Herodians and upper crusties in the Roman Empire.
I like that. I'm going to use that, upper crusties. I like that.
Well, if you think about it, in the book of Acts, it's astonishing. It's Roman authorities. I do not regard, like Professor Walsh, I don't think we can much rely on Acts as an accurate historical document. I think it's an apologetic document, in large part fantasy, a fantasy travelogue, which was kind of genre
that was in vogue
as well. I don't trust it as history, but on the other hand, the tradition about Paul there is consistent. It's Roman authorities who are constantly protecting Paul. It's Roman government authorities who are constantly protecting Paul from normally angry Jewish crowds who are angry about how apparently he's changing Judaism. And we can see that argument in Galatians when Paul is actually arguing with fellow members of the Jesus
movement. And he says that he's not a liar a couple of times. Like one of the letters to Corinthians too, he says, I'm not a liar.
We've got Paul talking to Herod Agrippa and his sister in Acts. And Herod Agrippa at one point says, well, gee, Paul, you're almost making me a Christian. Now, that's an extraordinary line, it seems to me, that where you've actually got a Roman client king there saying, Paul, boy, we wouldn't have had to do this if I'd only known that this was a mere religious dispute. We wouldn't have even sent you off to Rome. We'd have let you off the hook right here, is the implication. So throughout the New Testament, it's really hard to miss the sharp contrast, the sharp opposition to, at one point in Matthew, Jesus says that not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion has more faith than any Jew, any of them, period, end of report. Jesus calls for converting the whole world. Paul opens it up to Gentile. These are ideas we would not find from your mainline Jewish Messianic of the first 2 centuries. In fact, it seems to be a critical response to those very people.
I'd like to add one more thing to that real quick, and let's let her respond. Do you think that, on top of everything James said, but when you're done responding to him, my question is, what do you think about the we document of Acts? the parts of it that some scholars think date earlier, and it was stitched together by an editor that wrote Acts later.
Is that for me or for James?
It's for you, but when you're done answering what he said.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add to that is, I guess the key word in what you're saying there would be an idea of some kind of mainline position among Judeans at the time under Roman authority, except that, Paul is a Messianic Jew, at the same time, right? So while his approach may seem, and this may be an accident of preservation to some extent too, we actually probably don't know how many other voices there might have been. What we can extrapolate are, some of the conflicts and things like Josephus tells us, right, about later conflict. And we have to understand that as its own kind of apologetic too, given the auspices under which he's writing. So I think that what you generally have in terms of output from Judeans in this period are the same kinds of forms of resistance and discourses that you tend to see with any occupied peoples, coupled with different factions within Judaism, of which Paul is one, that sees these things and has its own rationale for both the present moment and for the future. And in Paul's case, there are a couple of distinctions that I think are important. One is that in this period, not all Jewish sects, which is the term we tend to use for Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Sicarii, etc. Not all of these sects believe in resurrection, but Pharisees do. So within the Pharisaic movement, it's not strange for him to also have some idea of a resurrection, right? And so because of that, I think that gives you, which leads kind of to the second thing I would add, just again to nuance some of what you're saying, which is that when you factor that in, then I think Paul's ideas become more sensible within the scope of Jewish thought within the first century and Messianic thought within the first century. Because unlike some other groups, he does have an understanding of resurrection. Therefore, he can postulate that the reason that there have been so many failed, and I think there's no other way to put it, but failed Messianic movements to that point, or hope in certain figures who proved not to be Messianic. I think John the Baptist is probably one of them at the time. And, you have these figures who over and over again resist the way the earthly Messiah is supposed to, and then get killed. Resist, get killed. Resist, get killed. Have their heads cut off, violently executed.
May I ask, are you aware of any peaceful Jewish messianics apart from Paul and the Christians in the first 2 centuries? Isn't Messiah, in effect, a political point? And the way that the prophecies understand it is from Isaiah, say, we're talking about Jews coming to world political military rule. And that seems to be, obviously, the expectation of the militants. In terms of numbers, I think it's pretty obvious that the majority were we have 2 massive wars, not just the first one.
Reading about Masada too.
Terrorist activity throughout. And so I would suspect that it's probably your wealthy elites who are working with Rome who are going to be the pro-peace ones, whereas your ordinary Jew on the street is who's messianic is probably thinking in terms of politics. Messiah means king, and for them it meant earthly king. And so Messiah as such, outside of Paul, seems to be a pretty political. You'll notice what Talmudic Judaism does in the wake of all this. It downplays the whole concept of Messiah or spiritualizes it. Furthermore, we know the Romans used Jewish messianic religion for their own propagandistic purposes. Josephus makes this perfectly plain when he says Vespasian is, in fact, the true Jewish Messiah, when he in fact says that Daniel's army in the clouds, like a Son of Man vision, was seen over the siege of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So we have Josephus, a Roman propagandist, actually utilizing messianic religion, which is what you'd expect them to use if that's their enemy, but turning it around to Roman uses. But apart from Paul and the Christians, the concept Messiah appears to be a political one.
But we wouldn't have even known about Paul if Paul's letters didn't survive.
Well, this is true.
And Paul is talking about super apostles. We don't even know what those are. He talks about his opponents. We're not quite sure who they are, although you can tell, like if you want to use the word theology, there's a little bit of a different theology there in terms of, following the law, not following the law, circumcising, etc. So it shows that it's also Jewish, to some extent, or at least, is in understanding itself as a Jewish movement at that time.
Yeah.
And had Paul not written anything down, had those letters not circulated, had they not, in my opinion, made themselves available, at least in part, to an author like Mark, who I think has read Paul based on how he structures everything we've been talking about earlier in terms of philosophy, etc., you wouldn't have had evidence for Paul either. And frankly, there are debates within scholarship about whether or not Josephus is actually talking about Jesus, or whether or not that seemingly peaceful movement, although we can debate that, right? Depending on how you see the swords and clubs that he and his disciples are armed with, depending on how you read that, or whether you consider it historical. But those passages about Jesus and Josephus have been disputed as well, about whether or not they're interpolation, right? So without those, again, accidents of history, you wouldn't have had knowledge of Paul, the super apostles, of which we barely know anything, the opponents of which we practically know nothing, or Jesus, right? So that's why I think we need to just, think about, usually the warfare gets recorded, but the peaceful movements don't, or peaceful resistance doesn't. And I think you have some evidence of what was perceived to be the activity or intention of the Son of Man as a militaristic figure in something like Revelation, which, once you get past the beginning saying, hey, this is all about Jesus, and then it switches to Son of Man, it's incredibly violent. And it is a military conquering, all of that language is conquering language. And so I think what Paul brings into all of this is that he has a messianic movement, one that is seemingly peaceful, one that innovates insofar as in the Pharisaic tradition, and adherence to an idea of resurrection allows him to argue that, so what I was saying before is, you have these figures come up, claim they're Messiah, or people think they are, and they die over and over again as these forms of resistance, until you get to Jesus, who's one in a long line of these figures. What Paul is arguing is that in his reading of Scripture, his understanding that, this was a curse, but one that is prophesied and necessary, that by seeing the resurrected Jesus, that first great evil, that first great archon, and death is often referred to as archon, has been defeated. That's how Paul knows what's happening, right? And that's militaristic too. It's just not one we can see, right? So just because, and this happens in Revelation as well, the war is happening in heaven, right? This war is, and Jesus is marshaling, as Christ is marshaling his army in heaven, and this heavenly army will vanquish the earthly archons. So it's militaristic. It's still quote unquote violent. It's just not the violence we can see, but it's coming, right? Like that, the promise of violence is there. And that's why I don't care about the Romans, because they're going to get theirs, right?
When we look, for example, at the Passion narrative itself, a discussion I had last year with Bart Ehrman, no less, Professor Ehrman freely admitted that the Passion narrative, to him, in his mind, is political parable. The crowd demanding Jesus' death, Pilate declaring Jesus innocent in all four of the Gospels, the betrayal of Judas. When you add that all up, it's clearly fictional. Had the Sanhedrin wanted to execute Jesus, they would have had him stoned, and they could have, as they had before the power to do so. And as we learned from Josephus, they did stone. The Sanhedrin did order stonings, and Josephus even cites the letters from Romans giving the Jews this authority. So had the Sanhedrin been the primary impetus, they wouldn't have needed Pilate. So what appears to be happening in the Passion narrative shared by all four Gospels is an intentional exoneration of the Romans for what is clearly a Roman execution and a blaming of the Jews. In Matthew, it goes so far, the crowd says, his blood is on us and on our children, the very generation that'll suffer in the Jewish war. And so the entire structure of the Passion narrative shared by all four Gospels appears to be pro-Roman political fable, parable. When we add to that the notion that what we have in Paul is a spiritualized Messiah, that is to say, the function is an end of the world, final judgment Messiah. His Messiah is not a political leader per se, but the guy who comes at the end of times, and it'll happen soon. And don't worry, we should all be prepared for it. He's absolutely believing in this. And I think in the wake of the destruction of the temple, in particular, two of the three major groups of Jews, according to Josephus, believe in the resurrection of souls. With the temple gone, they need a new salvation mechanism. They don't have the high priest asking for on Yom Kippur for the forgiveness of the people's sins. They don't have the animal sacrifices prescribed under Mosaic law. We need a new redemptive mechanism. And so Jesus becomes the new symbolic temple. And we have a new covenant of blood, even in 1 Corinthians. So even whether 1 Corinthians is written before or after the war it becomes pressing for these Jews who believe in it, resurrection of the souls, to have a new redemptive mechanism. And Jesus becomes that full new redemptive mechanism, but a spiritual one. In the Gospels, he says, my kingdom is not of this earth even, which is striking in contrast to what I can tell is every other Jewish concept of Messiah.
Let's let her comment. And after that, I do have one question myself, and then there's a super chat question I need to get to.
So I like this idea of a pro-Roman political fable, or at least the idea of the passion narrative being in some way an allegory to something else. But just I would always want us to keep in mind a couple of things. We don't know in this period with these gospel writers whether or not, though they're apparently writing in Koine and aware of Greco-Roman philosophy, whether we're still dealing with people who are Jewish, right? So I want to make sure we don't create a false dichotomy that imagines, Christians, Greeks and Romans, and Jewish people as separate categories, that we can rely on those categories being separate. Because the thing with the Romans, and there was one thing I've been sort of, debating, should I say it, should I not? But I'll say it because I've already foregrounded it. But I mean, the one thing about the Romans, and actually all of the authority, it's not just the Roman authority, to take my own criticism that I just leveled about making sure we're conscious of categories. All earthly leaders in the Gospels are sort of, it's almost like a tidal wave, like they perform these actions and they're either not aware of what they're doing, or they're sort of, Pilate's a facile leader in a sense, because he's just like, well, I don't know, like that is not instilling confidence like your authority figures, right? Like, crucify him. Oh, you want this murder to go, like, fine, like these are not respectable leaders. And also the Herodian family, whether or not it was still in the imagination of readers by the time the Gospels are written, but at least it is the case. They were converts to Judaism. These people were not, Judeans in the first respects of being, they had to convert to that religion, that family. So whether or not people are remembering, well, these Herodians are client kings, but they converted in order to rule over Judea. They're not actually, part of the fold. Let's put it that way, at least in terms of local leadership. That's something I wonder if we should keep in mind here as part of it. So when you have these kinds of discourses that could be very much intra-Jewish discourses in a time of upheaval, I do subscribe to the idea of the Gospels being written after the war, in part because I think there was a desire, after that war, to start documenting things, right? Or at least come up with a narrative that goes back to a period before the war in order to understand the Jesus movement and all of its political implications, but to use that as scholars often say, to think with about the current political moment after the war. And one reason I think we know this is because this, other than the Jesus going to the temple as a child, because it was there, other than something like Mark 13, which predicts its fall, which prophets often do, there is no temple. And so whoever's writing this doesn't know what it's like to go to the temple anymore, right? Like, there's a cultural memory. But Jesus is a Jewish figure living in this period who otherwise the temple seems to not be there, even for Jesus. And so I think that that's an interesting...
It sort of look like it's not part of Jesus's own context.
No, he's there when he's 12, right? he follows the law, obviously, but it's not dominating the narrative, which anachronistically we think, well, these are Christian documents, so there is no temple, except it's a document that I think it was used as a Christian document later, right? We do not know who these people were when it's written. We can make some educated guesses. Based on education level, things we've been talking about, we do not know. So what they are documents that are describing a place and a people at a time that no longer exists, right? And so that's why, when you say this word fable, that sort of jumps out at me. What was it like before that temple fell? What was it like, leading up to this cataclysmic event that is cataclysmic, not just for the Judeans, obviously, but the Romans can't stop documenting it, talking about it, building monuments to it, stamping coins, right? They can't stop reveling in it. So there is nobody whose hands are clean in that respect. That's the wrong word to use in light of Pilate. Sorry. There's nobody who is not thinking about this, right? There's nobody who's not mulling this over at some level. And the story of Jesus as a figure, again, to think with and think through that conflict and to retrospect back to that time and place becomes a really interesting mechanism. I think that's an interesting prism to think through all of this. And Paul's letters then come in as, maybe one of the only things that were written down to give us an idea of how the messianic piece of this could have worked. But all of that, I still see, at least for Paul, within Judaism.
What do you make of the super apostles in Paul? I know you said earlier that there's not much we can say about them, but would it be logical to suggest that they're likely Torah orthodox, since Paul mentions that he seems to be in conflict with people that were in Christ before him, and we get to see an example of that play out in Galatians, confronting Cephas to the face over circumcision.
I know, I was thinking about that.
The Herodians, we're told by Josephus, are constantly having problems with Torah orthodoxy. They are converts, as Professor Walsh just said. Your conservative Jewish people really didn't think of them as real Jews. They're just recent converts. The rebels certainly didn't like them at all.
That's what I was wondering. I'd want to look at Steve Mason's work again on this, who writes on Josephus too, and I'd want to, review it a little bit. So that's why I'm always a little bit like, unless I've read 6 books, because I'm an academic, I worry. But I do wonder what the imaginary would have been about that family.
We're specifically told that, for example, daughters of Herod Agrippa I would have their pagan husbands circumcised, and then later, when they got married to a pagan husband, they didn't make him get circumcised. So it was an issue. We're also told that at the Jewish convert kings of Adiabene, by Josephus, that there was a rabbi who was teaching that you didn't have to get circumcised to join the house of Israel. So these kind of issues about circumcision and Torah orthodoxy would have been most pressing with, I think, these Jewish aristocratic leaders. Josephus gives us evidence of that. But more than that, these God-fearers, these converts to Judaism who want to worship Yahweh, the Jewish God, but circumcision for an adult male is a big step to take. And so Paul's Gentile mission, or among these Jewish elites, that I think Paul's very issue with the law would come up. But you're right, in the opening chapters of Galatians, Paul is having a fierce conflict. He's condemning outright, he's damning outright people like Cephas and James for being more Torah.
Not eating, yeah. And I imagine, it's funny, sometimes I give my students actually kind of a trick question. Maybe I shouldn't say it, so I can't use it, but they won't watch this maybe, so. I never tell them I don't want them to see me on YouTube, because I found out they run these things at 1.5 speed or 2 times speed to go faster. And I don't want to sound like Mickey Mouse, so I don't let them know.
I won't let them know, Professor.
But sometimes I give them, a quiz question, like what are the kind of the same question, but I do it based on what do we think Paul is doing, because we're also in the position of having to kind of reconstruct that too, because he keeps talking about these displays of power, or these pneumatic demonstrations, these demonstrations of the Spirit, and you're like, what on earth? But as far as we can tell, And I'm sort of, putting a bunch of like Corinthians and Galatians together here a little bit, but obviously we have Corinthians and Galatians on the mind today. But it seems to be some of these pneumatics demonstrations, which may be characteristic of super apostles, are things like speaking in tongues, prophesying. Healing seems to be one of them. Whether or not we're going to the extent of saying that these people can resurrect, I don't know. I tend to think that the miracles attributed to Jesus in the Gospels are allied to whatever these spiritual demonstrations were, in part because Jesus does them with the Spirit in the Gospels. So I think they give us a clue to what might have been going on here as demonstrations of their sanctification as, representative figures of some either Messianic movement or holy person. So I think the super apostles are probably doing something along those lines, like Paul, but I think the distinction is what you've highlighted here, which is Jewish movement. Therefore, circumcision and the law and dietary restrictions remain the order of the day. Paul's thought seems to be that there's a new covenant, that the law, he says, is still spiritual. The law is still, as I've said before, operational as a covenant between the Jewish God and his people. But then you have this new covenant through Jesus's faithfulness with the Gentiles. And this new covenant, this is why in Galatians he talks about Sarah and Hagar, and he talks about the adoption of sons and that kind of language, because this new covenant allows, he uses this language of grafting in. So he grafts the Gentiles back into that family tree of Abraham. And in doing so, the covenant between God and the Gentiles involves, it seems to me, things like baptism and Eucharist, right? So if you are in Christ through baptism, through Eucharist, and you have the Spirit, which is the thing that through the adoption ritual, which seems to be the baptism ritual, you are now baptized back into that line of Abraham. What seems to be going on with the Corinthians is they're like, oh, well, I have the Spirit now, so I'm going to speak in tongues. The Corinthian women, right? There have been books on the Corinthian women prophets. I think Wire wrote a book about this several years ago. But he seems to be particularly frustrated with, the speaking in tongues and the interpretation of speaking in tongues by certain members who claim that they have the Spirit. And then, of course, I seem to always go back to this. We don't have to talk about the prostitutes today, but there's definitely a concern about including the prostitutes in Christ, by accident. So that's another interview. But all of these things as a piece sort of give us an inclination of what's going on here in terms of what might have been on offer by super apostles, by Paul, and the opponents. It's a little bit clearer that the law. I hope if you listen to these people, the knife slips the next time you try. Think about circumcising. Harsh words.
Let me get to the super chat because this has been waiting.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. Mark Bilby, thank you for your super chat. In Vincent's forthcoming edition of Apostolicon, 90% of the biogeographical details about Paul and the letters are absent. Might the Apostolicon be earlier in your view? If so, what implications ensue?
Boy, I can't wait for that book myself.
I get the feeling that this question is more aimed at Robyn.
Yeah, it does connect to what Professor Walsh was saying earlier about the Tarsus connection. All that stuff could be later.
Yeah, I think a lot of the details we have about Paul are increasingly interesting to me as matters of what we might call apologetic, or just sort of filling in the blanks, right, of this figure. And I just remain unconvinced, although, I still have time to continue to mull this over. But this construction we tend to have of the Pauline churches, and that Paul establishes these churches and they're faithful to him and they continue to go on and they communicate with each other. And that's the beginning of this network of Christian community. And, I just don't see as much cohesion as we would like to see. I guess you might say it as like from a sociological standpoint in these letters. I think we have, what's the word I want to use? And I'm going to get back to the question. Don't worry. But I think we have sort of idealistic notions about how these kinds of processes of conversion work. And so we have an idea that, people will decide, well, I'm what we might call a Christian now. Therefore, I'm not going to talk to my neighbor who's not. I'm going to disassociate from family members who say I'm crazy, and I'm never going to talk to them again. And I'm only going to focus on this one thing and forget my job, forget my friendships, forget, my affiliations. The God-fearers are a perfect example of this, right? People were capable of holding multiple positions at one time and being sort of curious about other, right? It's just how human beings work, right?
And what a great point. It is so easy to oversimplify the sides here. Josephus does not like the Herodians, and he's writing Roman propaganda. He's a friend of Herod Agrippa II. He tells us so in his autobiography. On the other hand, he's there with him at the siege of Jerusalem with Titus.
That's a very different story when he's no longer writing for them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he'll ascribe to his great-grandfather, Herod the Great, a terrible, gross death, or to his father, Herod Agrippa I, this divine punishment death. So Josephus, although writing Roman propaganda, has no problem being critical of Pilate.
I've got to butt in this for a second. The Herod Agrippa I, he died of like worms in his gut, something like that.
Fact, Josephus'
like the explosion of Judas and Luke.
It's not exactly the same. What it does remind you of within Josephus, though, is his account of Herod the Great's death, his grandfather's death. There seems to be a divine punishment that Josephus is pointing to there, and a divine punishment of Herod Agrippa I, who I think was claiming to be a god in Josephus's description right before his death, and therefore Josephus gives him a horrible divine punishment as well. But more than that, Josephus,
I shouldn't laugh at that.
And more than that, Suetonius isn't big on Caligula or Nero either. Romans could be anti-Herod, could be anti-Roman emperor, could be critical of Roman governors and Roman governments at the previous time. That's absolutely no problem. So we shouldn't look at the Roman side of that in a simplified way. Gee, they're critical of Pilate in the New Testament, therefore it couldn't have any connection with Roman elites. Not at all. Roman elites were critical of Pilate and the Herods and so forth. That I think is important to bear in mind here as we go through this. In terms of the super apostles, Paul gives us the first clue in Corinthians. He says Jesus had these post-death appearances. He appeared to James and Cephas, the 500. Lastly,
he appeared to me last.
Right. So one of the real tests of being an apostle is having one of these visions of the risen Christ. Now, I'm not sure that the original people who had these visions of the risen Christ thought of him as the world's savior, the redeemer of all sins, or changed our relationship to Torah, making these arguments that Paul makes. On the other hand, people before Paul had similar visions of a risen Christ. And I think that may have been the first ticket for admission to being an apostle.
And I think that some of these, to the super chat question, biography, biographical elements, that we have of Paul, many of these are 2nd century. Yes. Or many of these come not from Paul himself or from extrapolations from things Paul has said. And I don't think we can presume success. I don't think we can presume that, I think that there's a concerted effort, certainly, later on to make Paul a foundational figure, where his claims about seeing the risen Christ become essential, right? Because he inserts himself into the rest of the story. Otherwise, he has no authority. The authority are people like James and Peter, who nothing's from them. We don't even know what happens to them.
Yeah, the super chat question was basically asking if you think that the Apocryphon, Marcion's collection of Paul is basically the original text, which thereby making canonical Paul a large expansion.
I have great respect for Professor Vincent and Dr. Bilby too, but I do not think that it is that Paul was added. The true Paul was Marcion's. I think Marcion's cut out from Paul rather than post-Marcionites added to Paul. Let me put it that way. Even with all my respect to Professor Vincent.
And I consider, rightly or wrongly, this corner. So a couple of things. This corner of the field, kind of the purview of Dr. Vincent at this point, although I've been reading his work and sort of dipping my toe in, trying to figure out my own position. I'm convinced utterly that we have neglected Marcion in the field to our own detriment. And I think this comes up particularly, one question that I've been thinking about lately is, how do we know the Gospels are anonymous? And how do we trace that history? And there are two scholars that I'd like to recommend on this, in addition to the very important work that Dr. Vincent is doing. One is Dr. Jeremiah Coogan, and the other is Dr. Dana Lucci, who have, Lucci has this very delightful title for an article on the anonymity of the Gospels called Cata Pac-Man. And he relates the naming of the Gospels, the later tradition of titling the Gospels or naming the Gospels, to the way that we don't know the author of, say, Pac-Man, right? But we consume video games nonetheless. And so he thinks about that question of anonymity from that angle, which I think is very, very clever. But then Jeremiah Coogan has worked on this question of the titling. So different than naming, but the titling of these manuscripts later on. And I think there's an interesting piece to this, which is, why doesn't Marcion ever say Luke's gospel? If Luke is supposed to be associated with Paul, would have helped his case, right? He just talks about the gospel. So just to give you like a couple of little pieces there where I think there's more ambiguity going on with Paul still, even going into thinking about Marcion.
I am convinced that Paul's letters seem to have developed in redactional layers, and that many of them do appear to be compressions. So, and the theology of Paul probably developed over some time, over decades. So I'm in that sense, I'm not sure whether it's second century or actually a first century development, which I tend to think the development within Paul's authentic letters happened within the first century, but it developed over time, and I do believe it's probably in redactional layers, and that some of these letters are compressions. In that sense, I agree with Marcus Vincent a great deal. The Gospels being second century, that is becoming far, far more tempting to me. And also, the gospel that we're told Marcion preserved, the Lord's gospel, gospel of the Lord, the more I look at it, and this has been a lot of your doing too, Jacob, in our discussions, I'm beginning to see more and more as a source for Luke. It seems to be it seems to be the kind of the backbone of Luke, in which we don't have nativity or genealogy stories. Certain other details aren't in there, but basically that gospel, although that contains anti-Marcionite material, which makes it curious that Marcion should preserve it. On the other hand, that could be Marcion's Luke.
And what's interesting,
and
I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to butt in real quick. What's interesting is the last time that you and I spoke to Bart Ehrman recently, he suggested that the first two chapters of Luke were not original to Luke. He thinks the infancy narrative and genealogy stuff, that business came later. But it made me think, well, Bart, you're making it look like the Lord's gospel now, especially when you take out the first two chapters of Luke. So I had to ask him about it, because at the beginning of the Lord's gospel has Jesus. It just skips over him having parents. He doesn't have parents at the gospel of the Lord. He descends from heaven down to earth to Capernaum. And the Gospel of Mark, in the beginning of it, it seems to flip it, right? He starts in Nazareth.
Baptism.
Yeah, Nazareth, and goes to Capernaum. In the Lord's Gospels, he goes first to Capernaum and then to Nazareth. So it's kind of they're talking. He's going to the same places, but the order is different.
Well, that whole Logos introduction to John is there, and then it starts in, this is the testimony of John, like it's the beginning of the book, and then the last chapter sort of ends with the very same formula that the end of chapter 20
contains,
suggesting it's added on too.
And it contains a huge aspect of Luke's triple tradition and double tradition in the text. A lot of it. Just want to put that out real quick.
That is very interesting. But you can see why Professor Kramer thinks, because the beginning of Luke is very philosophical, John, very philosophical. And then there's a moment where it cuts in and appears to start, well, this is the testimony of John. Maybe that's the original beginning.
There is another super chat I want to get to, and I don't want us to veer off topic too much from the politics of Paul. But the one last thing I'll mention is this is a very interesting thing about the whole deal, the gospel of the Lord, is that Tertullian says something very strange. At one point, he suggested, okay, well, Marcion thinks that he wrote his gospel first. And then after he looked at the four gospels, that in which he viewed as plagiarisms of his own, he published a revised version of his gospel, or some version of it later, as a response against the four, despite being the guy that started it. And Tertullian says, no, I don't buy that crap. He shortened Luke. And I just think that's interesting that he's saying all that at the same time. But we do have a super chat that's been waiting for a while. Jesus is a Muslim. Thank you for your super chat. Google 14 million gospel found in Turkey. Daily Mail. Pope contacted Turkey in 2012 and resigned. This Aramaic Barnabas Bible prophesied on Muhammad. Well, I thank you for the super chat, but that is not anywhere close to what we're talking about today. The Gospel of Barnabas is written probably shortly after the Quran, and some think, like Dr. Blackhurst, for example, that Barnabas was written in several layers over many centuries. In either case, I think that there's no relevance here. I doubt either of you want to even address this.
As no fan of Ratzinger, it's kind of rad.
Yeah. But
it just seems obviously anachronistic.
I mean, if we were talking about Islam today, I mean, that super chat would have made better sense.
The idea is to try and interpret first and second century ideas, just as a general rule of thumb. Sorry.
I will Google that though later, just to see.
Yeah. One thing I will say quickly about it, because this person did super chat a little bit there. It's like, it looks like it's based on Irenaeus to a degree. Not what Irenaeus says directly, but what the sect, the Simonians or whatever Irenaeus is talking about. Simon of Cyrene was crucified, not Jesus. And later on, somebody else says, actually, Judas was crucified, not Jesus, which is in the Gospel of Barnabas. But I think there's an earlier text that talks about Judas being crucified and not Jesus, or alludes to that, and Judas being made to look like Jesus. But it looks like it starts with Simon of Cyrene, and then some other sect replaces him with Judas being crucified instead of Jesus. But it's essentially the same story. But that's all I'm going to say about that.
It just seems to me that we have a central fact here. A guy named Jesus was crucified under the governorship of a guy named Pilate. And until I'm given a good reason to believe that someone would make that up, or how they'd make it up, or why they'd make it up, that central fact seems to me, obviously the New Testament gives a highly, highly mythologized view of Jesus. I don't take it as history. On the other hand, Paul, our early Christian writer, believes in an earthly Jesus born of a woman, buried. If Josephus was interpolated, he still has a Jesus there. It just seems to me we have a historical Jesus. And until I hear a good reason why that central fact would be invented, I'm sticking with a Jesus who was crucified under Pilate.
Yeah, and just to be clear, because I've discovered later on that people have questioned whether I'm a mythicist, and I didn't know what that meant, and now I do. I do think there was a historical Jesus. Whether he's the Jesus of the Gospels, I'm not sure, but I just don't understand Paul's conflict with Peter and James otherwise, or what Peter and James are doing otherwise, and to then have to go to that next step to try to propose that, well, they made up a guy. So now, you have all of these layers of guys making up a guy, or, they are the remnants of this movement within Judea that was, Jesus was a central.
Yeah, that's been happening lately. Some claimed that Robert Eisenman is a mythicist. He's not. Some claim that Margaret Barker is a mythicist. She's not either. And I've done interviews with both of them. Eisman, I've had him on 5 times. And Barker, I had her on once, and they're pretty clear. They're not mythicists.
It's funny. Strange.
but I will say that the interest in critical thinking through these things and understanding problems of historiography, that's crucially important, and that's at the heart of all scholarly investigation into these texts, into this time period, and the thinking through, well, what are the objectives of these authors, and how do we wrestle with that in terms of what we might call the historical value of the things that have been left behind, and who's preserved them and how they've passed on, and couple that with the material record. I mean, that's what we all do. And I think the discomfort comes in realizing that the kind of the chain of command from, these texts to the canon as we see it are not as secure as we would like. But again, this is back to human beings, right? We're imperfect, and our chain of preservation is imperfect, the people who have controlled it over time. And this actually relates back to the super chat that we just, it's easy to, kind of say, well, Daily Mail, giggle, rightfully so. But the question being raised there is, a question of preservation and reliability and historicity, and, the nature of our evidence and what human beings do to mess it up, right? And all those questions are worthy questions.
Here we're talking about fallible human beings. We're talking about 2,000-year-old evidence here.
Right. And
we're doing our best to put together the evidence that we have as best as we can. And that's really
what concerns me is how far does it go? Okay, so somebody over there says Jesus didn't exist, and then there's some more extreme mythicists that you might not have heard of them, Robyn, but some of them think that Paul didn't exist either. And some of them go as far as saying Josephus didn't either. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. John the Baptist, everybody in the New Testament.
But John the Baptist is my favorite. I don't want him to not exist. He's my favorite. Yeah, but here's where, this is asking these questions. It's great. And I think it's great for all of us to do it. And then those of us who have, tortured ourselves with years of learning ancient languages and, trying to look at these texts, we'll go about investigating these questions, and then I think it's crucially important for us to come back and do shows like this, right? To talk about what's out there.
I just want to say familiarity with Greek actually is a pleasure in terms of reading Greek poetry and Greek philosophy. I have other reasons for that. If it weren't just the New Testament, boy, why did I go through all that learning Latin and Greek?
Oh, that's my happy place, is translating Greek somewhere with a library staff. It's true. But this stuff is, because here's one thing. Josephus, isn't he from the Galilee?
He tells us he's from a priestly family that works at the temple. He was assigned as a general.
He was the head of the garrison, right? And if it's a family line, wouldn't Josephus's dad might have known Paul? You know what I mean? Like, when you think about it, like, these are questions we should ask, though.
They both claim extraordinarily similar backgrounds, in a sense. Pharisees who seem to have some Essene messianic leanings, which is strange for a Pharisee, but it's a sort of like they're in that same intellectual milieu. And the astonishing overlaps between Paul and Josephus are many. Josephus was a critic of circumcision. The Jewish rebels demanded that even their pagan allies be circumcised if they were going to come fight the Jewish war. And Josephus boasts in his autobiography, I am opposed to forced circumcision and I wouldn't make our allies do that, ... Or Josephus talking about other aspects, or just right on all four.
And one thing Josephus says as well that I've always found interesting is I think this is Josephus. And this was, I think, from Elizabeth Rawson's work. But that he mentions that in his day, Platonism was no longer in fashion. And, this is when everybody's turning Stoic, right? So that also gives you a sense of timeline in terms of some of these texts to do some comparative work, because, Paul's still steeped in Platonism on a level that I think by the time you got to the late 1st century, might not have been, again, like as in vogue, right, at the time.
This isn't the age of Plotinus yet. This is the 2nd century. We're still in the age of.
So Josephus gives us an indication of intellectual trends for
Right.
which Paul and the gospel authors are subject,
Yeah.
both in terms of what's informing their work, but also reception of it. And so it's those things that I think we can think about.
It's absolutely fascinating that Josephus, in one of his major works, compares the Essenes to the Greek philosophers, especially the Stoics. In another one of his works, it's the Pharisees who he compares favorably to Greek philosophers, especially the Stoics. And so Josephus is, in effect, attempting to, and you got to see it that way too. I mean, even though he's a Roman propagandist, he's trying to rescue the Jewish people to a certain extent and their traditions. He's defending Jews against slanders and against Apion, for example. And he's writing this whole history of the Jews in the antiquities. He's trying to defend Judaism in effect in the wake of the Jewish war, even if he's writing Roman sponsorship. And so what's interesting is that he will attempt to impress his audience by saying that Pharisees in one work, Essenes in another work, well, they're just like the Stoics, don't you know? They're just like Greek philosophers. He'll very much, just saying that the rebel philosophy is a fourth philosophy, and these innovators. I think what he's trying to do is whitewash the existing mainline, the Pharisees and Essenes, who may have well been part of the Jewish rebellion. He's trying to whitewash those standard groups and make the rebels an entirely different, new innovation, when in fact they were probably ultra-conservatives within Judaism who were the rebels.
It's interesting to think too about how Philo plays into this as well, which is why it's so important to look at Josephus and Philo, but also think about this is why, again, back to accident of preservation seems to be at least a theme for me today that I'm sort of harping on. But, they're preserved largely by, we think, later Christians who reflect back on Philo and Josephus as giving contextual information about the era of which we're talking about. And I think Josephus and Paul might be the only two Pharisees for whom we have any writings at all. I think that's the case.
Identified Pharisees from the era. Any writings at all? I think you're right.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any other self-identified Pharisees from that era that we have at all.
And so that's actually back to the first super chat, which is we know so little. We have these two figures. We don't know a lot about their education, but that's why we have to go back to these sources, right? To try to reconstruct, this is what we can tell, back to they're elite, but they're not. What was the word that you used that I loved? Crusty?
Upper crusty.
Yeah. They're crusty. They're not maybe upper crusty, but they're crusty, and they're crusty.
They're pretty crusty.
So we can tell. And actually, I think, Jacob, I missed one of your questions about the we passages. I know that those passages appear in Homer, right? So I know that there's debate about this. So back to that question of education and how we can reconstruct these things, they're all of a piece.
If just half of what Dr. McDonald says is true, I ask myself, what the heck? These guys are incorporating on purpose elements of Greco-Roman literature and the most popular literature of the period, Homer, into their very and would our typical Jewish zealot, Messianic of the period, be interested in incorporating Homer, much less Neoplaton?
Well, it raises the question of why are they writing, right? And so there are two things going on here. One that relates to Philo and Josephus, actually. And then one that relates to this question of the development of these movements. If these people we assume that they are writing back to Paul for communities that are cohesive and established and circulating only within their own little orbit, which I've tried to challenge in my own work. Because writers write because they want someone to read it. And I'm married to a writer. So, I don't mean to be anachronistic in that too, but I think that this is one historical truth, right? Writers don't usually write to just throw it out. They write in order to, have it read and to demonstrate their own, not just competence, but art, and facility with whatever genre they choose. And by genre, I both mean literary genre, which, in antiquity, the concept of genre isn't as, formed as it is for us today. But, why pick prose over poetry? Why pick, a play over, art, like drawing, or, like making a fresco or something else, right? So they want these things to be read, but they have to show their skill, and you show your relative skill by engaging with the literature of the age. And when we break down these artificial barriers between what it meant to be Jewish, to be Roman, to be Greek, to be Christian, to be, not, or anything in between, you start to see, you write these things in a way that's going to get attention, that shows that you know what you're talking about, that you've gone to school, that you can cite these authors and these kinds of books.
Professor Walsh, I think you've, to my mind, whatever else he says, you put to bed the idea that the Gospels were sort of the organic creations of religiously faithful communities springing up with it. No. These are educated people writing for other writers who are aware of the basic culture of the time. And the idea of these as being purely the creation of some religious community by and for that religious community.
Yeah, it's the by and for, right? Because I'm sure they know they're in a Jesus group, or they know somebody. Like, why else do they have the topic?
Right.
But you have to also be somebody, like, people can wear more than one hat, so like you might be affiliated with a Jesus group and then realize, wow, I really, want to make a comment about this Jewish war. Jesus is and I've been reading these Stoic texts, like you can see how it comes together.
Just that there are a lot of Greeks and Romans throughout the empire who would go to one cult one day and next week go to another cult and read this over there, and go through phases and moods even about it, or entertain the different ones at the same time. Let me suggest that would be very hard for me to imagine coming from a Jewish rebel of the first 2 centuries. They resist assimilation. They are ultra-nationalist Jews. For even though there may be Greek ideas slipping in through osmosis, they can't help it. Nonetheless, they would be self-conscious about resisting foreign influence.
Yeah, can I say, this is actually the point I was going to make about Philo and Josephus, however, which is that I think in their way, they're doing the same thing. Meaning that Philo in particular, but it's also present in Josephus, whenever they give credence, again, this is my construction of this, but the way that I read them rhetorically is whenever they give kind of a nod or a tip of the hat to, say, Platonism, Stoicism, Greek and Roman literature in general, they'll be like, but Moses thought of it first. It's always there, and so there's a recognition of, who's in power culturally, socially. And it's the Roman Empire. There's no question about that, and education, as far as we can tell, and again, we know very little about education for, say, a Pharisee, but it's in these texts like Homer, right? They're aware that but there are claims, there's a cultural competition going on, and whether we want to think of the word competition in the strict sense of, competition, or, we want to soften that, definition a little bit, but you see it there rhetorically. And so there is still like Judaism, older, more respected, had it first.
Yeah. Josephus believe in the antiquity and the superiority of their religion. There's no doubt about it. They're Jews, and they're incorporating pagan elements and comparing Greek and Roman philosophy to it, but they are working for the Romans. Those are exactly the kind of people who would be doing that. Josephus and Philo. Philo comes from a Roman tax collecting family in Alexandria.
Well, he's married into the aristocracy, through family connections. But also, it's even more dangerous for them in some ways to make the claim, because their texts are circulating, and because of those connections, I think both of them have equal risk in those senses, but. It's something I think for us to consider, that I'm trying to remember which one said it, and I want to say it's Philo, but maybe not. But one of them says at some point, like, men who claim to be of Greek learning will, cite all of these other kinds of sources when really in their heart, they know it was us first. Like they know what they're talking about could be found in the Jewish scriptures, and they just, so they're frauds. They will actually come out and say that. And so I think it's important to reread both of those authors.
I agree.
Understand some of what we've been talking about in terms of even
We're
politics.
behind on the super chats. Let me take this one. John D, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Walsh, could you speculate wildly about Mark for a couple of minutes? Who he was, his goals, his audience, his sources?
Yeah. You want me to speculate wildly?
Wildly now.
Wildly. I think that there would be merit in going back to reconsider how much Rome features prominently as the center of his conceptual universe. And I think that that's something that the field has drifted away from, and rightfully so, in order to sort of shake up the foundation of this claim that Mark was at one point, I think, the scribe of Peter. Is that in Rome? Is that the tradition on this? And so I think, as scholarship started to realize, we can't take that at face value. That's 200 years later, like somebody made that up or whatever it is. We have to start taking Mark on his own merits and try to figure out who he is. So let's dismiss Rome, right? But I think there's a way that you can read his interests, read his literary influences, so that he is, again, I don't mean literally in Rome, but conceptually, Rome seems to be, and the Roman Empire seem to be at the heart of what he's writing. And I think that comes through in his use of philosophy. I think it comes through in even how he constructs geography in the text. And I think that we would be well served to stop treating him like the sort of uneducated of the four. I know that sounds kind of strange, but people will say like, oh, well, his Greek is terrible and his sentence structure stinks. And all of this is kind of true. But it would be worth it, I think, to go back and see like how much of that is intentional on his part, or how much we want to denigrate an author for not being as artful with his words as maybe another, but artful with the quality and complexity of his thought. And again, something that I think in translation gets lost, and I think in the perpetual use of Mark as this foundational document for better written, fairly, and potentially more interesting in the sense of like, plot twists and details that you find in, say, Matthew or Luke. Poor Mark gets lost in the shuffle. And so I would like to reconsider Mark along those lines.
Well, lots of people have noticed that Mark, and especially Luke, just don't seem to know the geography of the area very well.
But Mark has this idea, right, that like the closer Jesus goes to the city, the more corrupting things become, until like he goes into like the urban center, and that's where he gets killed. And like that is both a literary construction and kind of a cultural idea, right? So it's those kind of things that when I say, conceptually Rome is at the center, I think, so then the self-promotion, I do have a chapter coming out on this. There's the next quest for the historical Jesus volume that will be coming out shortly. I expect the proofs any day.
Very exciting.
And I did write something about, and this kind of goes to my point about how Mark, I think, gets a little bit neglected, because we're still, at least in the field to some extent, and I'm sure I'll find out if I'm wrong with this claim from anybody who's watching this, but we still use terms like the Messianic secret to describe what's going on with Mark. That concept is, I think, 100 years, like exactly 100 years old. Like that is coming from some very outdated, and I don't want to disrespect anybody, but some scholarship that needs reconsideration. And I think that the Messianic secret can be better explained, and what I try to do in this chapter that's forthcoming is explain it from a literary standpoint rather than just saying, well, it's a theological problem.
Yeah, you're getting me excited just when you describe it like that, Professor. That's fascinating. Scholars have long observed Latinisms, especially Latinisms that might be used by the Roman army in the Gospel of Mark. And it's true that Mark's Greek is not John's or Luke's. It's kind of crude by comparison. But on the other hand, we do have an early Christian tradition that says that Mark was written in Rome, and that the first version, and that a second version was written in a more spiritual one in Alexandria. That comes from relatively early Christians. I just find that fascinating in itself. There are people who've compared, for example, Jesus's triumphal entry on Palm Sunday to a Roman triumph, the triumph of the Roman emperor. Now, when you consider the other Roman cult imperial language, that is so echoed in Christianity. We have inscriptions from Augustus, for example. They announce the good news. The good news, my friends, of the world's savior and the bringer of world peace. And many of the same titles and language that are used in imperial cults are used about Jesus. Again, rather paradoxical when we consider the Jewish rebels of the first 2 centuries. They would be the last person who would use imperial cult language, which is being incorporated here. But I think there is a good argument to be made that there's something very Latin, maybe even located in Rome, about Mark.
That's the speculating wildly part.
That's the speculation, Professor. No, I really
like a little carrot.
I can't, honestly, to be fair, I cannot say where Mark was written.
No, I can't either. But just the idea to dispel with the 19th century constructions of theology to explain, who he is.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting suggestion, this other evidence, isn't it? Mark might have been written at Rome. It certainly doesn't seem that the person was too terribly familiar with the Jerusalem area. And if you think about it, Mark 13 is a big fat warning against rebellion. Don't do it. You're going to lose. The temple will be destroyed. Not one stone left on another.
Yeah.
The temple's going to be wiped out. Whoever picks later on or earlier on when he's arrested in Gethsemane, whoever uses or picks up a sword will die by it. Well, literally that's false. Lots of people who use weapons or initiate physical force die of natural causes. So what he's meaning in that context, though, is a warning against rebellion pretty clearly. It's hard to miss the aspects of political statements that are all over in the New Testament that are very surprising when you consider let me put it this way, the non-elite Jewish messianics of the first 2 centuries who would have very big objections to any of this.
Dr. Bilby, thank you for your super chat. How might you map out Parthian versus Roman imperial conflict in Josephus and the canonical New Testament texts? Are there New Testament texts on the Parthian side?
Ooh. Parthia was an ally, a very passive ally. The Jewish rebels wanted to elicit Rome's great rival in the East, obviously. The only ones who would really put up a challenge to Rome in the East were the Parthian Empire. And so the Jewish rebels were reaching out to the Parthians to be allies. But much to their disappointment, Parthia never really joined in with the Jewish rebellion. And I, for the life of me, can't find pro-Parthia stuff in the same sense that I can find almost directly pro-Roman stuff, where, like Jesus is praised for a centurion, or his pay your taxes to Caesar, line, stuff like that. There's no pro-Parthian politics, let me put it that way, in the Greek New Testament, as far as I can see. But certainly, Parthian religion had long been an influence on Judaism. Since the return from exile 500 years or 600 years before Christ, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, I think there was a tremendous Persian Parthian influence on Judaism at that time.
Robyn, did you want to address the super chat?
I'll defer to my co-interviewee here on that, although I was just looking up 2 scholars that I want to recommend for your point about Roman military, which are Mark Letney and Matthew Larson, who have worked on incarceration and on Roman military. So I'll just, if I don't mind, if I can use my time to refer to those 2. And I'm sorry that I had to look at my phone for a minute, but and it's because we've been talking about the Gospels. I couldn't remember which one was Mark and which one was Matthew. So I wanted to make sure I got the names right. But Mark Letney and Matthew Larson.
Myth Vision Podcast. Thank you for the super chat, Derek. Can we all just admit Dr. Walsh is the best by saying amen? Grab her book and get ready for her lectures.
Hi, Derek.
Derek, you and I both know that she is the coolest thing since sliced bread, okay? Yeah, I recommend every word that Professor Walsh has written. I think it's critically important to this discussion, and I can only echo the amen from friend Derek Lambert. Okay.
Thank you.
Nice, I
Go
second
out,
that.
get her books, and look for the next one.
Yeah, I should. I'm trying to get my grades in so I can work on it, but hopefully I'll finish it this summer.
Oh, Myth Vision, another podcast, another super chat. Thank you, Derek. What if the earliest Jesus groups were educated?
Yeah. It's kind of my point.
The earliest Jesus group.
Yeah.
Well, I think to be especially on the religious side of any of these movements, you do have to have some kind of education. I mean, you look at for example, let's take the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians themselves. They were literate. They were educated in their own traditions. As I say, Greek ideas were already by osmosis filtering in, even in the Maccabean period, even. So in the second and first centuries BC, even there we can see that our hardcore militant separatist Messianic Jews were literate, educated. So we're talking about compared to what situation? And we're talking about, I think with Jewish rebels of the first and second century, we're talking about the mass movement and what you might expect there. But I would ask you to contrast the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents with the New Testament, because we don't have first century, alas, documents from the first century rebels, but I think the closest approximation to what their positions would have been can be found in those sectarian documents. They're militant like the sectarians of the Dead Sea Scrolls were. They're nationalist, separatist, messianic, apocalyptic. It just sort of checks off all the same boxes, and it makes sense that they would be part of the next step in that developing tradition.
And it's sort of the nature of the evidence. And I think that's something we have to pay attention to. And one thing that I have tried to argue, I guess is the way to put it, but one thing that I've thought quite a bit about in doing my work is, why do we have an idea of the opposite, or at least why do we have a predominant idea that these are groups, people who are producing these materials are, in groups and communities, are, not educated, despite the nature of what we're seeing with these documents. Where have we come up with that construction, that historical construction? And it seems to me to be something along the lines of what we receive in Acts, or at the end of the canonical Gospels, this idea of, these fishermen huddled in an attic. And I think sometimes we make a little bit of a well-intentioned but historical mistake in assuming that the people that Jesus ministers to in the Gospels, those must be the original Christians, right? And so the Christian groups must have sprung from those groups of people he's talking to, that he's healed, that he's performed miracles for. And what that does, though, is just aggregate the nature of the evidence, right? These Gospels are later. Paul does not emphasize that Jesus, he tells us a couple of, or one teaching of Jesus's from the historical Jesus, but his emphasis is not on the kind of stories that you then get from the Gospels. So our earliest evidence for Jesus groups are not the Gospels and the people that Jesus is surrounded by in the Gospels, the fishermen, the lepers, the people who are from caste society that do need love, attention, healing, compassion, right? And that's an important part of Jesus's message, and one I'm not trying to take away from. But the earliest evidence from a historical perspective for Christianity is Paul, an educated Pharisee, that then by the time you get to the Gospels, you have these texts being written in Greek. And the only people who could have done it are people who are educated. And then here I'd like to note the fantastic work of Candida Moss. And she has some articles on this in a forthcoming book this year about, the people who, so take Luke's preface, who are the sponsors or the patrons of this kind of writing. They don't have to do the writing themselves. They can pay for somebody to do it, but still take kind of credit for it as the person who's sponsoring it, right? Those are elites as well, right? Both cultural elites, educated elites, and possibly more economically elite than we traditionally associate the early Christian movement with. And of course, that's challenging because of what the Gospels tell us, right? Or because, it's central to the Christian message that there's redemption for those who are downtrodden, who are not wealthy, who are not, the elites, whether, again, cultural, economic, societal. And that's a message I think resonated with people rightfully. I think it's an ethical message that is crucially important today as much as any other time in human history. And that shouldn't be taken away, but we shouldn't confuse the resonance of that message with the people who carried it forward through the documents and the nature of the evidence that we use.
Well, see, and that's it. I am pretty well convinced. Well, first of all, yes, kudos to great Professor Candida Moss. Do you want to announce anything at this point, Jacob, on that? I'll just leave it. I'll just leave that sort of hanging out there.
Well, yeah, I will at the end.
We may hear more from Professor Moss on this channel. I'll just leave it tantalizing out there like that. I'm a great admirer, as everyone knows, of Candida Moss. But it seems to me that the rebels definitely would be most popular among the poor and the disaffected, as opposed to the wealthy who were succeeding in Roman society at the time. So our rebels are more likely to be this category of the poor, or the poor priests, or even within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the concept poor is used as sort of code language for their own group, even though not all of them were poor. And even if, as Josephus says, the Essenes held all their property in common and were concerned about the poor, that's something the Essenes seem to have shared with the original Jesus movement, I would put forth. And that's where that actually comes from. But then again, Josephus himself praises the Essenes for this economic policy and admires them Josephus admires the Essenes greatly for taking care of the poor and holding their property in common. So that's not unique to the rebels, but let me suggest that poor language is coming from the rebel end of it. Politically speaking, it makes more sense to me.
We also can't forget that often elites use references to people who are, not elite to make their points, meaning there's also a literary trend in this period. It's not just a literary trend. I think it's a rhetorical move that's often made that, and we still do it today, which is that, the eggheads in the ivory tower don't know everything. It's the everyman, right? Or every human, but the every person who has greater, whether we call it street smarts or we call it, what's something else you would hear? Like, I went to the university of like the real world, right? Yeah, hard not, right. So we still create this dichotomy, and perhaps, it is earned in some ways, but my point being, in this period, there was very much, you see it in the Greek novel, the idea that the true person of faith, and this is Greco-Roman religion, including Judaism and including what we might call Christianity or any other tradition from the Greco-Roman era and the Roman era, that, somebody who grew up in the country, never went to school, spent their days, out in the fields, are more in commune with nature and with the gods or with God than somebody who went and studied it for their entire lives. And so to have those people both at a time when that is a dominant discourse, I would say, among elites themselves, but also to have that featured in texts that are trying to talk about the Galilee of Judea, which is a place where you're more likely to find people of that ilk than, say, within Judea, within Jerusalem. It fits, right? And so, but we should not mistake, especially when you see the activity of Paul. Paul is not going around Judea trying to find Gentiles, right? That's not what he's doing. And so when we're talking, again, historical versus literary constructions of history, what we have is Paul going around the eastern part of the empire, talking to people about his idea about this movement with Gentiles who are curious about Judeans and about Judaism. That's what he's doing. And he's teaching them about the Jewish scripture, and he's coupling that with the Greco-Roman philosophy that makes him kind of, plugged in. I think you used the word popular before. He's plugged in to popular ideas at the time. And then the gospel authors pick that up, but they know the region they have to talk about. And this is back to the mythicist thing too, right? Like they know the region they have to talk about. They have to talk about the Galilee. And they reconstruct the people there. And I would say that there's a social justice aspect to this that I think is important, and being attentive to these reconstructions of the poor and the downtrodden and Jesus himself, and remembering that we have to think about these persons and what they represent as more than just fodder for understanding, a conceptualization, an idealization of the early Christian movement, and to think about those.
It's a huge part of contemporary Roman literature. Vespasian himself plays up his humble origins. He's a country bumpkin. And
Augustine does the same thing, actually.
He plays up his humble origins. He came from poverty. Vespasian's a self-made guy. He jokes around about his countrified accent. And, in Latin, plaustra, plaustra, that kind of thing. Not only that, his son Titus was born in this humble little shack in lower class Rome. And when he became emperor, became a pilgrimage site for the cult of the Flavians. They'd go to the humble place where Titus was born in miserable poverty, only to become the emperor of Rome. So Roman emperors were using specifically that kind of propaganda. We too come from the common guy. We too are the best for the poor. If you read Pliny the Elder's dedication to his natural history, which was published in the reign of Vespasian, his friend, he compares Vespasian to God. What makes Vespasian godlike? His father-like love and compassion for all of his people. When you read Suetonius's biography of Titus, he stripped all of his mansions of all of his wealth so he could help the poor who were suffering from fires and disease. So it was a massive, being pro-welfare and being pro-poor and being from humble origins was an important part of contemporary Roman political propaganda at the time, as well as Christian ideology.
Yeah, Augustine actually does the same thing, where he says, I didn't have any friends because I was just smarter than everybody. So no one could keep up with me. So I just stayed at home. And just I was a homebody who's self-taught, but I just kind of naturally knew all these things. With the idea of plugging in, not because you're coming from you're not, you ignore the fact that you've got, your father's the emperor. Ignore the fact that, somebody left you, a trust fund. Forget that. I'm a self-made, but people don't change that much, to be honest. So you see that throughout. I mean, even when people start speculating that Nero has resurrected.
The Nero. I mean, there were at least 3 phony Nero.
They're all rural dudes. There's a guy who played the flute.
Yeah.
He's kind of hot. He reminds me of Nero. He's a really good lyre player. I think I made a joke previously, he's like the Justin Bieber of this region. So.
Right, but how fascinating. Nero, we think of as this bad guy. We think of this movie Quo Vadis.
Yeah, everybody loved that guy.
The evil Nero in our minds fiddling as Rome burns. But think of it, he must have been popular.
Yeah.
Otherwise, these resurrected Nero things wouldn't keep coming up. And in the late 1st century, we have at least 3 of them.
Yeah, there's sort of a coddling rhetorical move around the Roman emperors. I mean, even Caligula, the name means little boots. Little boots. There's sort of this personalizing that goes on between empire and subject. That I guess made it more palatable to be ruled with an iron fist. I don't know, but you can kind of see that construction.
The whole deal, the fake Neros and Nero's supposed to come back, kind of reminds me of the idea Jesus is supposed to come back, and those people are going to pretend to be him. Many will come in my name and deceive many. Is what Jesus is.
Well, but there certainly were many rebel leaders who were obviously claimant messiahs. And I think that the false messiah warning is referring to these violent rebel leader messiahs, like the Egyptian or Judas the Galilean or Theudas in the 40s. Those are, or Bar Kokhba in the second room.
Yeah, Bar Kokhba. But, you even have it in Mark. Who do people say that I am? Well, some people think you're Elijah. Some people say you're John the Baptist. It was happening. This was something that was part of it.
Elijah resurrected or what? Right. Yeah.
Elias Almighty, thank you for your super chat. I take the position that the Gospels were composed post-Marcion. If one takes that position, given the date of the Statricon, doesn't that mean the Gospels directly take inspiration from it?
I imagine that's for me. So there are two schools of thought on the Satyricon. One is that it was written in the age of Nero. And one is that it's a 2nd century document by an anonymous author, because there are references in it. And here, there's a scholar by the last name of Roth who's written for Classical Quarterly on this, who's written a couple of pieces where she's figured out that there are many passages within the Satyricon that seem to be reliant on the letters of Pliny. So it would have to be after Nero. And so I take that research as the brilliant work that it is, and tend to think that we're dealing with a 2nd century document. So actually, it's kind of a chicken and egg argument, whether or not you think the Satyricon is from the age of Nero, or whether you think it's, Roth is correct and it's from the 2nd century. Either way, your question is valid. But I would say this, I think what it demonstrates is more that there are discourse, I've been using the word discourse a lot, but at least tropes, let's call them that, literary tropes out there, literary symbols out there that were, right for the taking, right? Like you could use them to communicate with your audiences certain both spoken and unspoken ideas. One is the empty tomb, which Richard Miller has also talked about, which appears in the Satyricon, at least it's implied. Of course, the Widow of Ephesus passage tends to be the one that's most on the nose, because there are 3 men crucified and a Roman soldier and a body taken down off the cross and a man in a tomb for 3 days, right? So, but that tale alone, classicists have also tied to what's called a Malaysian tale, which is even older than anything that we're talking about, right? So that's all to say, you could go back to the Malaysian tales and say, even if the Gospels were late 1st century, that they're using a Malaysian tale for the story of the 3 men crucified, or at least that trope, some of the details of that trope of the ravenous widow as well. So, and you see that in artwork. In other words, the correlation doesn't have to be quite so mathematical of one-to-one. And I think that there are trends in scholarship, as with anything, where, previous generations of scholars are very concerned with literary comparisons, like this particular Greek word is used here, and you see a parallelism, and therefore you can tell that there's literary borrowing. There's great merit in that work too, although I think right now the trend has been more like, let's break out of this mold, especially because our texts don't go back that, our surviving texts aren't that old, right? Like we don't have any what are called autograph copies of anything. So you're still relying on a telephone game of textual development. So you can only go so far with those kinds of claims, but you can say that these ideas are out there. These literary ideas are out there. These tropes are out there. And then if you go back to how education works, like there were homework assignments just like there are now, where you would have something like, write me a monologue. I think the one I've used in the past, and it always comes to mind because I always loved the Medea. Write me a monologue. Medea runs into Jason, like after she kills the kids, like at the supermarket.
What would that uncomfortable meeting be like?
Yeah, or like write Jason, Jason runs into her at the movies. Like what? What? It's not that, but you see what I'm saying. Like
I do.
The exes run into each other. Like what do they say? And so you would have exercises like that, or you would have sententiae, so like sentences that you would learn to write over and over again to learn. And so, these authors could have fallen back on something they learned in school, like, oh, you remember that terrible assignment I had where I had to read those Malaysian tales? I could use that for, I've done it. Like remember that essay I wrote? Like I didn't fail it. Maybe I can save it and turn it into an article, right? I think it just shows borrowing.
Professor Walsh, though, is that there are too much furniture that the New Testament and the Satyricon shared.
Way too much.
To be accidental. So I don't know whether it came before or after, and I wouldn't, bet the farm on that.
I mean, I'll say this.
You have demonstrated that there are elemental, there are furniture elements that are shared between Petronius and the New Testament, which is
or if it's not Petronius at the time of Nero, if it is 2nd century, and this person is in the intellectual circle of Pliny, right?
Yeah.
And Roth is right. This is the Pliny who's writing to Trajan,
right,
about Christians.
So that would have to be.
So you would just, like, and if you think about these tight literary networks, like what you're saying then is, if not in print, but in concept, whoever is writing the Satyricon is maybe aware of Christians. And so the shared, again, this is why these are like ideas that are out there for the taking, because you don't need to have the literary foundation to make the one-to-one comparison. You could just have some, I mean, Pliny's obviously not terribly educated in what's going on with the Christians. And obviously Pliny is not the author of the Satyricon, so I don't want to, blame him too much. But, there's discourse, again, out there, sorry to use the word again, but that's what it is, that, is accessible and possibly worthy of satirization, hence the title, or critique. And so that's something I think that we need to take seriously when we think about, the hardest thing in the world as a historian is, and I am a student of Ross Kramer's as well, and she used to say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? And so the hardest thing in the world to do is to say, this guy doesn't do me a favor, the Satyricon author, and say, and now I'm going to make fun of the Christians, like ...
That'd have been nice if they told us exactly
right. Now, somebody who does is Lucian, right? So Lucian, tells the story of Peregrinus, and he's like, yeah, he was a Christian for a while. He fooled them because they're all so gullible, and then he moved on, to the next. So, like, thank you, Lucian, for throwing up the flare so that I knew what you were making fun of. Right. But not everybody was so amenable or cooperative. And so there's another scholar, P.G. Walsh, who, no relation, although, he seems like he was an excellent scholar. So I wish I could claim him, but not knowing anything about his personal life, but just based on his scholarship, it seems that, he was really clued into these ideas because he tended to read Apuleius's Golden Ass, the Metamorphosis, as having some connection to Christianity as well. And we know that one way Christians were mocked, so back to satirization, was saying that they worshipped a donkey, right? So, he doesn't come, whoever the author, if it's Apuleius, any of these other sources, these authors are not always telling us Christianity is at the heart of a satire or a critique or an illusion. But it's interesting to play with those ideas. And some scholars, like Walsh, like Roth, although she doesn't link it to Christianity, it's in that same spirit of recognizing we need to reconsider these dates, these attributions, and think about how this literary borrowing happened.
Fascinating.
Icon, thank you for your super sticker.
I think
Myth Vision Podcast, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Walsh, do you think Jesus' hidden identity in Mark is working off Odysseus and Homer, or something literary in the Aeneid?
I think both. So there's some implications here, the Aeneid being written in Latin and the Homer writing in Greek. But the trope in question is the recognition of the hero. So, Odysseus in coming home is not immediately recognized, except I think by the dog. The dog. I think I have that passage right, one of the more heartbreaking passages.
He sees the scar on his leg too, the board.
Okay, all right. But there's a passage about the dog, right?
Yes, the dog.
I think that one made me cry.
The dog recognizes his master and then falls over dead. That's really.
No, I can't.
That's a hard,
oh, it's brutal. That passage is brutal. As a dog person. So there's that, and then it's a trope within the work a Virgil, where for example, Camilla. And this is in the chapter that I mentioned previously that will be coming out in the next Quest volume, that's edited by Crossley and Keith. In in Virgil, when a character like Camilla comes into the scene, the word that's used in Latin is akin to the Greek word thauma, which means wonder. And so whenever a hero comes into the scene and is not immediately recognized, usually the crowds around the hero are described as awestruck, as dumbfounded, as confused, bewildered. They don't recognize the hero. They ask each other, who is this person? And then the person leaves the scene, and there are some words where they're amazed or astounded to the point of just like being completely out of their minds. Like you say, you see different variations on this concept of wonder, and it's the exact language you have in Mark. So the thing that I argue in this forthcoming piece is that what the author of Mark is doing is tapping into that same motif that you find in Homer and that you find in Virgil of epic, where the hero is not recognized. So the thing we call the Messianic secret, Jesus comes in, he performs his miracle. People go, who the heck is this guy? He performs a thauma. He performs what we call a miracle. People go, who is he? What is he doing? They're dumbfounded, they're astounded, and he leaves. At least the reason I leaned on Virgil more than Homer, but here I think it's Dennis MacDonald's work that's being referenced, and I think it's a very strong argument to go back to Homer. I'm sure Virgil's using Homer, right? But the reason I lean on Virgil more than Homer,
yes, Virgil's definitely using Homer.
He's definitely using Homer.
Yeah.
The reason I lean on Virgil a little more is just because the subversive figure. Camilla is a woman and a warrior, and she's not supposed to be that. And Jesus is a Messiah who dies, right? So this idea of the subversive figure causing confusion, or the hero causing confusion, and then couple that with passages about not being recognized in your hometown, etc. I think that that's a literary trope, but the theological argument about Messianic secret, I think, has thrown us off that literary trope for some time.
Well, there are parts in Mark where Jesus says to the disciples, I talk to everyone else in parables, and I talk to you behind the scenes. I tell you all the truth, but I tell them so that they won't be saved, and I'm going to tell you so you will be saved. Where there's other places where Jesus says he performs a miracle. He says, "Shh, don't tell them that I did this miracle. Keep it under wraps." And so that builds up to the point where someone says, "Well, is there a theme here of a messianic secret? Is Jesus keeping this a secret?"
Yeah, no, and I understand that's a distinction in that particular argument, but I think that it explains. I think by leaning on the Messianic secret as an explanatory model for that structure of the gospel, that's the kind of thing, by focusing on theology, that throws you off the scent of what is being asked in this question, which is, is the gospel author working off of some literary trope they learned, a motif somewhere? What are they alluding to, right? And so then you can start to ask more questions about, like, well, what's up with this guy? Like, why is he writing this in the first place? It can't just be about the community, right? And then it's back to the thing about like, well, how do we reconstruct early Christianity? Is it the people who had no idea who this guy was and then he walked away? Like those are your early Christians. It's literary.
Right.
Yeah.
It's literary. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Gettysburg, the Maniac, thank you for your super chat. Jesus' trial in Mark, he is accused of blasphemy. Is this a mistake Mark received from an oral tradition incorporating scriptures from the Septuagint?
See, I wish I knew more about the actual historical trial and execution of Jesus. And the problem is that the Gospels, I'm not sure, are reliable in that regard.
They don't agree.
I wish I knew more. That there may have been aspects of that played a part in it. The thing that I think I'm most confident of is Jesus tends to be an apocalyptic, and the titulus says King of the Jews. So I think, and we have this whole lineage from David being, even Paul says he's of the seed of David, which is early, which suggests to me that maybe the historical Jesus was killed for claiming to be the descendant and heir of David, rightful king of the Jews, and may have been part of an apocalyptic movement, which was certainly associated with the rebels. I think that those are the things that may have gotten him in trouble with the Romans. But the priesthood was working with the Romans, and that kind of stuff would get you in trouble with the high priest just as much, maybe, or even more, because they're so afraid of the Romans, with them as well as the Romans. So.
I think it's so none of the Gospels agree on this. I think it's Luke has both of them. I think he has blasphemy and like sedition. And then I can't remember off the top of my head. I made a chart once. I kind of wish I had my chart. But they don't agree. And sometimes it's, political rebellion, and sometimes it's blasphemy. And so I think it's internal to the text and the understanding of the author in question, what they're setting up. Right. So right. I'm not sure if it's a mistake from oral tradition as much as it's actually kind of I was sort of struck for a moment by saying, I have to look up the charge of blasphemy and what it meant historically. I think the gospel writers probably needed to too. Right? So I think it may be internal to however they structured their narrative. They picked one or the other, but it's not like we have, a solid tradition that it was one, or a solid oral tradition that it was one particular charge that was then altered by a gospel author or something like that.
Maybe both were. But it's hard.
He wrote a little horse and a donkey at the same time in one of the gospels. So there's one way to translate it. I'm sure.
Maybe he was laying down, so half of his body was.
Well, I always pictured
on one, the other half on the other. I don't know.
But the truth is, we really don't have good historical reports of the trial of Jesus. The priesthood may well have been involved. I'm not sure what the exact charges were. I'll bet you it was for claiming to be king of the Jews or a descendant of David. That's all.
Again, the death was a Roman execution.
Right. The death was a Roman execution, and they perceived him as a threat. So when there's all this pro-Roman political cleanup, that's a post-event thing. That's going to happen decades later, in my view. Jesus' original followers wouldn't have been motivated to present Jesus in that way.
Gettysburg Demoniac, thank you for another super chat. Where does Mark get his narrative outline, and does this obscurity shed light on what Mark knew about the historical Jesus?
Papias.
Oh. Sorry,
it's hard to know. Papias indicates that Mark, we don't even know that Papias is talking about our Mark. But let's assume that the reference to Papias is about our Mark. He says he was aware of logia of Jesus before, oracles of Jesus written in Hebrew by Matthew. And there's a John the Presbyter logia, and there's an Aristion's logia. So there were written materials that existed before Mark, if that's what Papias is talking about. And let me suggest that it's to those written materials that we should look for sources for Mark. But without having those sources, it's hard to know how creative each of the gospel writers were, except by comparing their overlaps and their contradictions. So I wish I knew more, but there's a bunch of the question is I don't think we really have enough information to know.
I would recommend everybody take a look at Dan Alucci's article that I mentioned earlier on Pac-Man and the anonymous source idea, because he does go through Papias and he goes through Tertullian later, and the nature of our evidence for when we first see evidence of the Gospels being referenced, and when they finally get the titling later on. Again, Jeremiah Coogan's work is important here too. But the thing is, it seems that there was just kind of a general statement about there's a gospel out there, and it's not exactly clear what that is. It's not clear that even if it's something that we would recognize as, say, Mark, or relevant to Mark, there's no way for us to really reconstruct that, which is a nuisance, obviously, for us in the field, but keeps me in a job.
Employment for scholars.
Yeah, so I'm not complaining. But I would say this, my recommendation for how to get at it is kind of twofold. One is, I think, as I mentioned before, I'm convinced that Mark knows some aspect of Paul's letters. When I say that, I think there's a tendency to imagine that I mean he has, Thessalonians to Romans in front of him. I don't mean that. I think that his letters probably circulated outside of communities among literate elites, maybe 2-3 pages at a time. Here, I would also recommend the work of Anne-Marie Leyendyke at Princeton on this question. She works on Oxyrhynchus and on material evidence of papyri and things along those lines. And she has a piece in Karen King's Festschrift on this, where I think a couple of pages of Paul were found in somebody's library at Herculaneum. So I think we have to think about it in those terms potentially, but I think the author of Mark is at least familiar with the Pauline construction of things like Stoicism and Stoic physics. And I think that what you get in Mark, and maybe I'm back to speculating wildly about Mark, but you get kind of an idealized version of what Paul describes as his activity embodied by Jesus. You get an interpretation of Jewish law. You get pneumatic demonstrations, what we would call miracles. You get a history of Jesus that more or less corresponds with the sort of what's the narrative outline provided by Paul for what we would call the historical Jesus, which is pretty sparse, but it's there, including things like what I would call, or what we often call, the Last Supper. Paul claims that resurrected Jesus told him about that. So, you have a combination of what we call historical Jesus and resurrected Jesus funneled into, again, what you might call a narrative outline, I think, in the Gospel of Mark. And then whether any other materials came from any of the other sources that you cited, that's TBD.
It's Bird to Money. I think if you're super chat, did the Gospels original readers understand the text to be fictional? And if so, why did the readers later believe these things literally happened?
Wow, what a great question. Dominic Crossan has a famous line, right? It's not that we're so smart as to treat the literal as allegorical. We're dumb enough to treat the allegorical as literal. It could be that the gospel authors themselves, being literary constructions, and this reminds me of Jacob, our discussion with Bart Ehrman earlier this week, where he talks about forged and how much of the New Testament is just flat out forged, at least in terms of who it's claiming to be authored by and its context. So we have to bear in mind that there was pseudo epigrapha of Paul and Peter being developed in the 2nd century at the latest, and also bear in mind that there's what appears to be allegory going on within. Jesus taught in parables, and it does sometimes strike one that the stories we're told about Jesus are themselves parables. And so it could be that the gospel writers themselves saw it as true, but allegorically true, being influenced by Philo, among others, on allegory, for example. But I'm not sure that it wasn't intended to be taken as literal by listeners and others who might become aware of it, even from the outset. For example, the pseudo-epigrapha was meant to be believed to have been written by Paul, and the pseudo-petrine by Peter, when it wasn't. So there's some, I think, on purpose fraud, some allegory, and to what extent they expected the listener or reader to believe it to be true, I'm not sure.
I think that our modern constructions of fiction and nonfiction and history are probably not great measures of reception or understanding in the ancient world. I think they help, but I don't think that there's a one-to-one corollary to how that would have been conceptualized. Meaning, and actually here I have the title of a book, in a book that I can recommend by Bowersock, called Fiction is History, which I found informative at various points in my career. In antiquity, there's no way to confirm anything. really, in the strict sense. Small details about the far reaches of the empire are not going to be something you can Google. It's not something you can look up unless you have access to a library and the means for doing it. I'm actually thinking about, I saw a viral tweet where somebody said, like, before Google, how did you know something was true? And someone said, you didn't. Like, your aunt told you something that was crazy and wrong, and you carried that information for 20 years. Like, you just thought it was correct.
Most families, come on.
Yeah, but it's true. So there was a little bit, the way that we, especially the way that we, we train our students. It's and how journalism is supposed to work. You have more than one source, and it's verifiable, and you write books with footnotes, and you can trace back the information, and you can prove it, or you get sued, right? Or you don't copy someone, or you get sued. Those structures just didn't exist. And so I think people had a healthy appreciation and were able to suspend, or at least hold in tension both things at the same time. Probably Alexander wasn't born of a snake. Probably the snake didn't impregnate his mother. But I get the point, right? And so I think that's, I think it's something we continue to do, although we don't always see it, but we see it sometimes in iconography and political speech. We are selective. This is actually one thing that the Me Too movement revealed. Like, for some characters, we are, willing to hold them to account. For others, it's not part of the narrative we want to remember, so we don't. We do that with founding fathers. We do that. John F. Kennedy comes to mind as someone from Boston, right? So we have to keep that in mind, that we sort of selectively, as just cognitively, we do these things still. We've put some controls on them in modernity, but those controls were not there in antiquity. So I think most people could have a healthy appreciation for the purpose of the narrative trying to convey one thing, even if in the detail it was not.
Some of the more interesting
literal
discussions on this, Plutarch or Tacitus talking to us about historical method. Some people are so gullible they'll believe just about anything you tell them. Then there are other people, well, this sounds more credible. Just to hear those discussions by ancient historians like Plutarch or Tacitus within their work gives you a sense that they did have a distinction between this is all BS, this is reliable, but there are, Professor Walsh indicates, there's a fuzzy line between the two.
And it allowed them to kind of snipe at each other. this person just gives you fantasy. Listen to me, because
listen to me, right? Yeah. I'll give you a story.
Exactly, and So I think we just have, and Plutarch's a great example. So I think we have to keep these things in mind. That audiences, we have to do a couple things. We have to respect them enough to understand that they wouldn't necessarily take everything literally. Some might. But they might not necessarily have done that. They would have understood the purpose behind certain kinds of claims. But we also can't treat them all as a monolith. I was on a ride at Disney World once where a woman thought that the dinosaurs were real. So, there's a spectrum.
As we said earlier,
ways people understand this material.
Philo made a whole method of this. I mean, Philo would tell the story from Hebrew scripture, and he wouldn't deny the literal reality in most cases, but he would, in addition, give an allegorical interpretation to it. So there's an allegorical truth on something that he believes is probably true historically, and there's a fuzzy line in between. But he's using allegory as a method for understanding what was a historical report from his literature.
And like anything, when there are multiple layers like that, some people will take some aspects literally, some people will understand the allegory, some people will want to accept certain facts about the biography of a character, some people will not. Some people will, understand certain more fantastic elements as real, and some people will not. And this is something that scholars have debated forever. Did the Greeks actually think that there was a guy throwing thunderbolts or not, right? So this is something that we have been debating, and we cannot claim uniformity for the reception of these things, but we can understand, again, back to these literary producers, right? These elite literary producers. We can understand their objectives.
Yeah. It does seem when I'm reading Josephus, and Josephus says, I had this prophetic dream that told me Vespasian was going to be the emperor even before he was emperor. Or he tells us in all credulity a story of how a Jewish exorcist performed an exorcism before the emperor Vespasian and himself. And he reports it with perfect credulity. And so you wonder, okay, here's a historian telling us that he had prophetic dreams. Now that seems to me to be probably a lie. I had this prophetic dream and I want you to believe that I had this prophetic dream, which is probably just propaganda.
But then you run into the problem of Paul, right?
Right.
Which sometimes my students struggle with this too, because we'll read a variety of texts where they'll see that kind of prophetic dream and claims about, divination. And here I'll recommend the work of Jennifer Isle on Paul and divination as well. And so to a modern, audience, the idea of divination seems ridiculous, right? But usually one conflict that comes up is divination experiences. You can give, a plethora of information and accounts from antiquity of people receiving information from a deity through divination. And that will seem ridiculous, right? Or like, those ancients, isn't that quaint? And then you say, and then Paul told you about the Last Supper the same way. And so then, you can see the conflict there. And so usually what I say to students is like, well, then revisit your dismissal of the divination for other characters in antiquity, one's not more valid than the other, right? But then think about the nature of the claim in antiquity and how much distinction would there be between divination and a claim to historical accuracy, or what we would call, fact. And it just demonstrates, or I think reveals, how the nature of our standards of evidence have changed in modernity, and they don't apply to antiquity.
We can't
understand. Thank you for your super sticker.
Yeah.
And it looks like that's the last of the super chats.
I keep looking over here because a 4-year-old's going to bust through this door any minute. I'm visiting my in-laws, and everybody took him out to go furniture shopping, and I can't imagine we're on. I don't know how long that's going to last, and so I think I'm going to be handed a toddler shortly. So I know.
Short order.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think this would be the perfect time to close out, since we don't have any more super chats.
May I just say, Jacob, I enjoy these discussions with Professor Walsh and Professor Ehrman that you've so kindly hosted for me. I love them, and in particular, Professor Walsh. I think her work is extremely important for reorienting us to understand the New Testament as Greco-Roman literary genre material, and that I think is a vital insight. And I would urge all of our listeners to go check out Professor Walsh's work. I think it's very important. It's brilliant. It is scholarly, but it is also accessible to it. I think if you're an intelligent reader out there interested in the subject, you can get what she's saying pretty readily, even though it is for real.
All the footnotes.
Even despite all those footnotes. So I just want to thank you, Jacob, and I want to thank you, Professor Walsh. I love our conversations, and I hope our audience gets something from them.
I feel the same way. Thank you so much to both of you, and it's a pleasure to see you both again.
Yeah, thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation. And the links to purchase her book are in the description below. Check it out. All right. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.